When I was a teenager, I often heard my parents talking behind my back about how I was a nuisance, how I was a burden, how I was holding them back and preventing them from breathing properly. We lived in a Chicago suburb. Our house was small, but adequate for a family of 3. My father worked in construction, my mother in a pharmacy. In public, they seemed like a normal family, but at home, everything was different. I grew up with the constant feeling of being tolerated, not loved. When I was 15, my father once told my mother point blank, thinking I was sleeping, that I was a burden. The word stuck with me, and I've heard it from them many times since. I never understood what exactly was bothering them. I was a good student, tried not to cause problems, and worked after school to buy things for myself. But for them, I was still something superfluous. By high school, I hardly interacted with them anymore. I ate separately and spent most of my time with friends or at part-time jobs. They weren't interested in my progress or how I was doing. The only thing I heard was reminders that I'd soon have to support myself, otherwise they'd throw me out on the street. At 18, I took a job at a local store to pay for college. I studied business administration, and it gave me a fundamental understanding. During my student life, my parents only came to campus once, and that was by chance on their way somewhere. I never received any support, advice, or even a basic "we're proud of you." It hurt, but I learned not to show it. After college, I got a job at a real estate firm. I started as an assistant, but I persevered. I worked nights, researched the market, looked at all the available materials, and learned from my colleagues. Within a couple of years, I was already a sales manager, and 3 years after that, I became one of the top employees. During this time, I hardly interacted with my parents at all. We rarely saw each other, and every time they acted like I was a stranger. But once they found out I worked in real estate, they suddenly started calling more often. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, but then I realized they were interested in the house. Their house. It was old, with a mortgage they'd been struggling to pay for a long time. They started complaining about money, hinting that the bank was about to foreclose on the house. I hated it, but I knew they were in trouble. Eventually, I proposed a deal. I'd buy the house myself, paying off their debts and saving them from court. Legally, it made sense. I filled out the paperwork, paid off the bank, and the house officially became mine. I thought this would prove to my parents that I wasn't a burden, but someone they could rely on. But after the deal, their attitude didn't change. They continued to pick on me over little things, compare me to the neighbors' kids, and say I hadn't achieved anything serious yet. I endured it. But the breaking point came when I returned home unannounced. I walked into the house and heard my mother telling my father that they were now living on handouts from my son, and that it was shameful to depend on someone who had been a burden all my life. Something inside me broke then. I realized that no matter how much I did, they would never change their attitude towards me. A few days later, I gathered them in the living room and told them bluntly that the house was now mine, and that I was no longer obligated to keep in it people who had considered me useless my whole life. At first, they didn't believe me. Then they got angry, started shouting, accusing me of betrayal. But I had the documents in hand. They had no arguments left. I gave them a month to pack their things and find a place to live. At that moment, they looked as if their world had collapsed. But I no longer cared. For the first time in my life, I felt that I had strength and that I was no longer a victim of their neglect. They tried to appeal to my pity, called relatives to paint me as a monster, but none of them knew the whole truth. I never talked about what I went through. When eviction day came, I watched them drive away with the truck. No regret, no joy, only emptiness. But somewhere deep down, I knew this was the beginning of a new chapter in my life, one where I would no longer allow anyone to treat me like a burden. Several months passed after I kicked my parents out. I continued working, furnishing the house, where I now felt like the master. Everything was under control, but inside, I felt a strange emptiness. Sometimes I caught myself thinking that the silence in the house was too oppressive. Memories of them calling me a burden surfaced again and again. I tried to drown them out with work, meetings with colleagues, but at some point I realized that the past was not so easy to escape. Everything changed when I received a letter. It was addressed to my father, but the postman, out of habit, left it in the mailbox outside the house. The envelope was old, the paper yellowed, and the postmark was from another state. I wanted to just throw it away, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened it and read a few lines that completely changed my understanding of family. In the letter, The woman wrote that she had long regretted her decision, that it was hard for her to live with the thought of her son growing up with other people. At the end, she signed herself Laura. I reread it several times, not understanding what it referred to. At first, I thought it was some kind of mistake or an old story my father had told me about his past. But the words son stuck with me too much. I decided to dig deeper. That evening, I opened an old cabinet in the basement where my parents kept papers. There were several boxes of documents, receipts, and photographs. I started sorting through them, and in one folder I came across medical records from a hospital in another state. They were dated around the time of my birth, but the mother's name in them didn't match the name of the woman I'd considered my mother all my life. It was a different name, Laura Williams. My breath caught in my throat. I realized that the woman in the letter was my real mother. But then why was I raised by people who considered me a burden? The more I dug, the more odd things I found. The documents contained an address, old insurance policies, even photographs of a woman who vaguely resembled me. At that moment, I felt my whole world crumble. It seemed my parents had been hiding the truth all this time, that I wasn't their biological son. My thoughts raced. Maybe that was why they treated me like a stranger. Maybe that explained everything they said. I didn't know how to react. I lay awake for several nights, wondering if it was worth looking for Laura if she was still alive. On the one hand, I wanted answers. On the other, I knew I could open a Pandora's box. A week later, I finally decided to go for it. I found a phone number in some old papers, though I wasn't sure it still worked. When I dialed it, my heart was pounding like it was about to jump out. A few long rings, and I was about to hang up when I suddenly heard a woman's voice. I introduced myself, said my name, and asked if it sounded familiar. There was silence on the line, and then a soft sob. Her voice trembled, and she said she'd been waiting for this call almost her entire life. We agreed to meet at a small cafe in another city. I went there the next day. When I walked in, I recognized her immediately, the same woman from the photos. She had aged, but her features were the same. We sat down at a table, and she began to tell me. It turned out that I was born when she was very young. She had no family to help, and her father, her then boyfriend, had abandoned her before she was born. She was in a desperate situation. Then, through friends, she was put in touch with a couple who had been trying to have a child for a long time, but nothing had worked out. This couple turned out to be the people I considered my parents. According to the agreement, they were supposed to adopt me, and everything looked as if I was their biological son. Laura signed the papers, thinking it was best for me. She believed they would give me love and stability. But things went wrong. She didn't know they would treat me like a burden. She had no idea I would have to grow up in coldness and indifference. I listened to her, and my insides twisted. On the one hand, I was angry at her for giving me away, at my parents for hiding the truth and tormenting me with their treatment. On the other hand, for the first time, I saw someone speak about me with real feelings. There was so much pain and regret in her voice that I couldn't help but believe it. She told me she had tried to contact me before, but my parents wouldn't let her. They threatened to get a complete no-contact order through the courts if she interfered. She got scared and retreated, but the years hadn't erased her guilt. As I left the cafe, I realized my life would never be the same. Now I had two realities, the one in which I grew up with people who considered me useless, and a new one in which I have a mother who has suffered from being separated from me all this time. The questions kept coming. Why did my parents agree to take me if they didn't want a child? Why did they keep this secret for so many years? And most importantly, what should I do with Laura now? My mind was swirling with possibilities. Should I get closer to her and give her a chance? Or push her away so as not to open old wounds? I knew one thing, the truth was only just beginning to emerge. After meeting Laura, the words she had spoken haunted me. The more I thought about her story, the stronger my desire to know the truth from those who called themselves my parents grew. I understood that they no longer had power over me. They had no home, no documents, but a secret remained that burned inside. If Laura was telling the truth, then my entire childhood, all the years of humiliation and resentment, all their coldness had a specific reason. I had to find out why they had agreed to take in a child if they later treated me like I was unwanted. A couple of weeks after talking with Laura, I made up my mind. I found the address of a cheap motel where they stayed after being evicted. A neighbor who sometimes saw them in the area told me the address. I drove there that evening, stopped at a shabby building, and sat in the car for a long time, gathering my courage. My heart was pounding like I was going to war. When I finally went inside and knocked on their door, silence hung in the air. Then my mother opened the door. She clearly didn't expect to see me. Her expression first reflected fear, then irritation. She wanted to slam the door, but I braced myself with my hand and said I needed to talk. My father was sitting inside, looking both tired and angry. The room was cluttered, with cheap plastic containers of food on the table. The atmosphere was heavy. I sat down on a chair, and they tensed up, as if they expected me to come to finish them off. I got straight to the point. I asked them why they even took me in if they'd always considered me a burden. They were silent for a few seconds. Then my father gave a wry smile and said I would have found out anyway. My mother looked down, and he began to speak. According to him, they never wanted to have children. My mother had health problems, and doctors advised against pregnancy. But at some point, they had the opportunity to adopt a child through a program that allowed them to receive tax breaks and financial assistance from the government. They agreed because it was advantageous. They thought it was an easy way to improve their situation. But when I arrived in their home, they quickly realized that a child was more than just numbers on paper. I demanded attention, care, and time, and they weren't ready. They had neither the patience nor the desire to raise me. They viewed me as a source of problems. My mother admitted that at first she tried to bond with me, but the older I got, the more irritated she became by my reminders of her own limitations. She always wanted to live for herself, to travel, to have fun, and I was ruining her plans. My father, however, had a cynical view. He said that since they had taken in a child, they should have benefited. But when the benefits ended, when the financial assistance dried up, he began to see me as unnecessary burden. His words were like a knife to the heart. He said bluntly that I had never been a son to them, that I had always been just a tool. At that moment, I felt anger boiling inside me, but I held back. I asked why they had hidden the truth from me if they weren't going to treat me like family anyway. My mother burst into tears and said it was more convenient to pretend. It was easier for them to live when no one knew I was adopted. They were also afraid that if I found out the truth, I would leave, and they would lose even the crumbs they received from the state. They didn't want to be left empty-handed. A heavy silence fell over the room. I looked at them and realized that these people weren't just cold. They had lived my entire life in calculation, in self-interest. To them, I had never been a person. I was a project that had failed to live up to their expectations. My father added that they thought it was only fair that I helped them pay off the mortgage and buy the house, since it was payback for the years they'd supported me. My insides sank. I realized that not once in all these years had they regretted the way they treated me. There was not a shred of remorse. It all came down to money and profit. I stood up, ready to leave, but my mother suddenly grabbed my hand and began begging me not to tell anyone. She was afraid that my relatives would turn their backs on them completely if the truth came out. There was no sincere regret in her voice, no desire to apologize, only fear for her own reputation. I looked at her and told her that I had kept silent for too long, that I was no longer going to hide the truth. If they themselves were unable to admit their mistakes, I would do it for them. I left the motel and got into the car. My hands were shaking, my thoughts were confused. Now I knew the whole truth. Laura had given me away because she thought these people would give me a chance at a better life. And they took me because they saw an advantage in me. To them, I was a burden only because I did not live up to their expectations and stopped bringing in money. Everything I'd heard from them all those years now made sense. But instead of relief, I felt only rage and bitterness. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room of my house and stared at the walls that had once belonged to them. Now that space was a symbol of my victory over them. I'd driven them out, taken away what they considered theirs, and reclaimed control of my life. But with it, I received a hard realization that changed everything. I was no longer just someone my parents considered a burden. I was a child taken for profit, and that realization gave me strength, because now I had the truth, and I knew that this truth would be their worst punishment. After the conversation in the motel, I was sure that the end had been drawn between me and these people. I thought they would stay away now that the truth came out, they would have no time for me. But I was wrong. A month later, I received a notice from the court. My ex-parents filed a lawsuit against me, claiming I had illegally seized their home, taking advantage of their gullibility and mental state. The papers stated that they were demanding that the transaction be declared invalid and the property returned to them. When I read these lines, I was overcome with rage and bewilderment. Not only had they refused to admit their mistakes, but they had decided to strike me where it hurt most. The house had been a symbol of my freedom, my victory. Now they were trying to snatch it back from me. I contacted the lawyer I had worked with on the deal. He carefully reviewed the documents and said that everything was legally in order. The house was properly registered, the debts had been paid, and the title had been secured in my name. But he warned that the process would be unpleasant. My parents were planning to drag out everything they could and make me look bad in court. I had prepared myself for this, but I had no idea how far they would go. At the first hearing, when we met face to face, I saw them. They looked exhausted, but hatred burned in their eyes. They sat next to a lawyer, clearly hired with their last penny. The father spoke confidently. The mother feigned suffering, the victim of an abusive son. Their case was based on the idea that I, taking advantage of their dire circumstances and the weight of their debts, had forced them to sign over the house to me. They claimed they didn't understand all the terms of the deal, that I had deliberately deceived them. Listening to this, I could barely contain myself. I wanted to stand up and scream, remind the judge of all the humiliations, all the words burden I'd heard them use. But the lawyer urged me to remain calm. A court demands facts, not emotion. In response, we presented all the documents they had signed voluntarily, with their signatures and notarized. But I knew they wouldn't stop at the legal details. And indeed, during the following hearings, they began to spread lies about me. My mother sobbed, telling me I'd always been ungrateful, that I'd threatened them, that I'd deliberately isolated them to take over the house. My father added that I'd never considered them my parents, and that I'd acted out of revenge. Their lawyer tried to paint a picture of a cruel son who'd driven the old couple out into the street. It was like theater designed to elicit pity. I felt rage boiling inside. They were lying, twisting everything around, portraying themselves as victims. But I knew I was right. At one of the hearings, I made my decision. I told the court that I had recently learned the truth about my origins. I provided copies of documents found in their home, medical records, and a letter from Laura. All of this proved that I was adopted and that they had taken me for profit. Their faces at that moment were as if frozen. The judge listened attentively and asked for further evidence. I called Laura as a witness. It wasn't easy, but she agreed. The day she appeared in the courtroom, my parents turned pale. She told how she gave me to their family, hoping they would give me a better life. She admitted that she later tried to contact me, but they threatened her and wouldn't let her anywhere near me. Her words were simple, but they held a truth that couldn't be faked. In that moment, for the first time, I saw the mask of my parents crack. The judge looked at them with a cold expression, and their lawyer was visibly nervous. But even after that, they didn't give up. My father stood up and started screaming that it was all a lie, that Laura had made it all up, that I had put her up to it. My mother tried to feign tears again, but they looked fake. A mixture of emotions was boiling inside me. I understood that they would do anything to avoid admitting defeat. They didn't care about the truth. They didn't care about what I'd been through. For them, it all came down to the house, the money, and not ending up at rock bottom. But this time, everything was different. I had evidence. I had the support of a real mother. I had the truth. I watched the judge gradually lose patience with their endless excuses. I knew victory was near, but at the same time, I knew it wasn't the end. Even if the court left the house in my name, these people wouldn't go away quietly. They would try to take revenge. They would look for other ways to ruin my life. When I returned home after another hearing, I looked at my house with completely different eyes. It wasn't just a building. It was a fortress, a symbol of my struggle. And now this fight had reached a new level. I was no longer just the son they called a burden. I was the man who had exposed their lies and was ready to see this through, even if it meant going through the dirtiest courtroom battle. After the final court hearing, I returned home confident that victory was almost within my grasp. All the evidence was on my side. Laura had testified honestly, and the lawyer said we would likely win the case. But deep down, I felt uneasy. I knew these people too well to think they would give in, and my fears were justified. It all started with small things. Someone called my home phone several times and then remained silent. One day, I found a note on my windshield that read, "You will regret it." I chalked it up to coincidences, but then the threats became clear. I started receiving insulting letters accusing me of betrayal. At work, unknown people started calling the office, claiming I was a fraud and demanding that I be fired. I immediately realized who was behind it, but the worst came later. One evening, when I returned home, I noticed the garage door was ajar. I always made sure everything was locked, so this alarmed me. Inside, I found a broken light bulb and dirty boot prints. No one had stolen anything, but the mere fact of break-in was a warning. I called the police and filed a report, but I knew it would be difficult to prove their involvement. They were cunning and knew how to stay under the radar. A few days later, I received a message on my phone, a photo of my house taken from the street, captioned, "We'll return everything soon." My stomach sank. I realized they weren't going to back down. For them, a home wasn't just walls, it was an idea, a symbol they were willing to fight for to the bitter end. I installed security cameras and reinforced the locks, but the anxiety persisted. Every evening, I listened to every rustle, expecting them to reappear. The pressure wasn't just on me. After her court appearance, Laura also started receiving threatening calls. They told her she had destroyed the family and that she should stay away from me. She was afraid, but she didn't back down. She said she had been silent for too long and was now ready to go to the end with me. At some point, I realized their goal wasn't just to get the house back, but to break me psychologically. They wanted me to feel unsafe, to start doubting every step. But instead, anger welled up inside me. They had taken my childhood from me, tried to deprive me of my home, and now they wanted to intimidate me. I decided I wouldn't let them win. The hardest moment was when, late one evening, I saw a silhouette near the house. The man was standing on the curb, looking at the windows. When I went out onto the porch, he quickly left. I was sure it was my father. The next day, I went to the police again, but all they could do was record a report. Resolve was growing inside me. I realized that if they were going to play dirty, I had to be prepared too. I collected all the evidence of the threats, notes, calls, photos from security cameras. My lawyer said it could be a strong addition in court if it could be proven that they were behind it. But even without a trial, I felt that sooner or later there would be an open confrontation. And it did. One night I was awakened by a strange sound, like someone was fiddling around at the back door. I took a flashlight and quietly approached. When I opened the door, I saw my father standing there with a crowbar in his hands, trying to pick the lock. At that moment, everything inside me boiled over. I screamed that I would call the police, and he froze, then took off running. I ran after him, but he disappeared into the darkness. 10 minutes later, the police were at the house. I showed them the security footage, and they recorded the attempted break-in. But they were unable to catch him. The next morning, I received another note. "This is only the beginning." That's when I finally realized they'd crossed the line. This wasn't a fight for my home anymore, it was a war. They were trying to destroy me, to turn my life into a nightmare. But I was ready. I was no longer the teenager who silently endured humiliation. I had a home, a job, a real mother who stood by my side for the first time in years. And I had my most important weapon, the truth. I decided I wouldn't just win the trial, I'd prove to everyone who these people really were. They wanted to take everything from me, but this time they would lose. After the break-in attempt and new threats, I knew the situation was getting out of control. But that was precisely what pushed me to take action. I no longer wanted to sit back and wait for them to strike again. I wanted everyone to know the truth about who these people really were. Up until that point, my parents had tried to portray themselves as victims. In court, my mother played the unhappy woman, my father talked about my supposed betrayal, and even some relatives began to look at me askance. They believed their words because they didn't know the whole story. I was tired of being seen as the monster who had driven the elderly out of their home. I decided it was time to take off my masks. The first step was to gather everything I had. I organized the evidence: adoption papers, medical records, Laura's letter, her testimony, threats, photographs, surveillance footage. My lawyer helped me put it all together into a full-fledged case, but I knew a trial wasn't enough. The public needed to see the truth with their own eyes. And such an opportunity presented itself. My great-aunt was having a birthday party, and almost the entire family was going to it. I usually disliked such gatherings, but this time I realized it was there that I could put an end to this. My parents were also planning to come. They clearly wanted to use the holiday to complain about me and gather supporters. I agreed to come. When I entered my aunt's house, all eyes immediately turned to me. Some smiled, some looked away. I felt the tension. My parents were sitting in the corner. They looked at me with disdain, but also with a certain malicious anticipation. They thought I wouldn't risk airing my dirty laundry in public. But that's precisely why I came. After dinner, when everyone was seated in the living room, the usual conversations began. And as I expected, my mother was the first to broach the subject. She sighed loudly and said that it was hard when your own son throws your parents out on the street. Several people nodded. Someone cast a reproachful glance at me. My father picked up on this, saying that I had taken the house, that they were left homeless. Their words sounded deliberately plaintive. I felt the moment had come. I stood up and said that it was time to hear the truth. The room fell silent. Everyone looked at me, waiting for me to speak. I started by telling them about my childhood, how I was called a burden, how I grew up without support or love. I saw some of my relatives exchange glances. It was a surprise to them. Then I pulled out the documents I'd brought with me. I showed them the adoption certificate, the medical records, Laura's letter. I said that all these years they'd hidden from everyone that I wasn't their biological son, that they'd taken me in for the money and benefits. A deathly silence fell over the room. My mother turned pale. My father clenched his fists. I continued. I told them that Laura was my real mother, that she'd tried to contact me, but they'd threatened her. I told them about the threats, the break-in attempt, everything I'd been through over the past few months. I saw the faces of my relatives change. Those who had sympathized with my parents just a moment ago now looked at them with disgust. The aunt at whose house we were gathered covered her mouth, and my uncle asked them point-blank if it was true. My father tried to object, saying I'd made it all up, that it was a conspiracy, that Laura was just trying to break up the family. But I interrupted him and played the security footage of him trying to break into my house with a crowbar. That was the last straw. Shouts echoed through the room. The relatives began to murmur, and someone said it was shameful. My mother burst into tears, but her tears were no longer impressive. The masks had been torn off. Everyone saw them for who they really were, people who had used a child for profit, and then tried to break him when he became independent. I felt a weight lift from my soul. Everything they'd tried to hide for years was now out in the open. After that scene, they hurried away without saying goodbye to anyone. No one held them back. On the contrary, my aunt told them outright that she no longer wanted them in her house. Relatives came up to me, some apologizing for judging me earlier, others saying I'd done the right thing. But that didn't matter to me anymore. The main thing was that the truth had come out. When I returned home, I sat in silence for a long time. For the first time in years, I felt like I no longer had to justify myself, no longer had to prove I wasn't a burden. Everyone saw who they really were. It wasn't just exposure, it was liberation. Now they had lost not only their home, but also their reputation, their family, their support. They had destroyed everything they had. And I still had my home, my job, and most importantly, the truth, which made me stronger. After that evening at my aunt's, when everyone finally saw them for who they really were, I expected to feel relief. I thought the anger would go away, that the past would no longer burn inside. But it wasn't that simple. For the first couple of days, I truly lived on adrenaline, as if I'd won the most important victory of my life. My relatives stopped judging me. My neighbors started greeting me more warmly, and I saw pride and support in Laura's eyes. But then came the emptiness. I sat in my house, at this very table where I'd previously heard only reproaches and harsh looks, and suddenly realized the house no longer felt like my own. I'd wrested it from those who called me a burden. I'd proven them wrong, but there was no joy. I lived within four walls filled with other people's memories, and every reminder of the past hit harder than before. I tried to drown it out with work. I'm not a slacker, not the weak teenager they portrayed me as. I've been working in IT for 5 years now, developing and supporting corporate systems. I started as a freelancer, coding at night for pennies, then got a job at a company in Chicago and gradually became a senior developer. Work has always been my salvation. When people call you useless at home, you seek recognition elsewhere. I found it in what I did best, figuring out where others got lost. The money didn't come right away. I saved for a long time, put aside every bonus, and lived modestly. And when my parents started having problems with loans and debt, that's when my chance appeared. They couldn't pay the mortgage and were at risk of losing their house to the bank. I offered them a deal. We'd register the house in my name, I'd pay off the debt, and then take on the payments. They thought they'd deceived me, that I was just pulling the blanket, but for me, it was the only way to escape. And so I became a owner. I thought that when that moment came, I'd feel free. But sitting in that empty living room, I realized that freedom isn't just about the walls. It's about what's inside. And there was a hole inside me. Laura tried to fill it with conversation. She called often, came over, talked about her life, about how she dreamed of me all these years. I saw the desire to fix everything in her eyes, but years of lost time hung between us like a wall. Sometimes I caught myself angry not only at my parents, but also at her, for letting them take me, for not fighting to the end. And although I understood in my mind that she was a victim of circumstances, my heart didn't always forgive. I found no peace at work either. My colleagues were happy for me when I told them I finally owned a house, but I couldn't rejoice with them. I completed tasks, attended meetings, but inside, I felt like I was on autopilot. Every night, I returned to a house that felt more like a museum of my traumas than a fortress. The scariest thing was that I began to wonder, what next? My whole life up to this point had been a struggle, to prove I wasn't a burden, to reclaim the house, to show the truth. And now the goal had been achieved. My parents had lost everything, the truth had come out, the court had almost decided in my favor. What next? I woke up in the night and felt like I was losing my footing. It felt like without a fight, I simply didn't know why I even got up in the morning. In those moments, I realized they had finally achieved their goal. They had left a wound inside me that would not heal. Laura was the first to notice. One day, she asked if I was happy now. I couldn't answer. And then she said that true victory was not only to destroy their lies, but to build something of my own, something stronger and brighter than the past. I didn't know if I was ready for that. My hands still clenched with rage when I remembered my father standing at my door with a crowbar. My chest still tightened when I heard my mother's voice complaining about me kicking them out. I felt like I lived in the past more than the present, but Laura was right. I could sit in this house, surrounded by ghosts, or I could try to fill it with new life. The problem was, I didn't know how. And it was at that moment that strange events began, jolting me out of my usual emptiness. First, I received a letter from the bank stating that someone had tried to access my accounts. Then I received a call from work informing me that anonymous complaints about alleged fraud were being sent to my corporate email. It all seemed like a continuation of their war. But this time, it hit me harder, because I realized that not only was I stuck in the past, but I was also at risk of losing my future. If I didn't pull myself together now, they would completely destroy me. That night, for the first time in a long time, I fell asleep with a clear thought. Either I learn to live for myself and not to fight them, or they will win, even without the house or the court. When the court finally ruled in my favor, I didn't feel jubilant. Yes, the house was now officially mine alone, without any reservations or attempts to contest it. Yes, my parents had lost everything, their property, the trust of their relatives, and the respect of society. But instead of joy, I felt a strange sense of emptiness. It was as if a huge weight had been lifted from my back, but with it, the energy that had driven me forward had vanished. For many years, I had lived for one goal, to prove that I was not a burden, that they were wrong, that I was capable of taking control of my life. And now that goal had been achieved. All that was left was me, the house, and the silence in which my own thoughts were all too clearly audible. At first, I tried to justify myself. I told myself that this was justice, that now I could build my life anew. But every evening, as I walked through the rooms, I remembered how their voices had sounded here, how my mother had irritably called me useless, how my father had looked at me as if I were stealing their air. These memories couldn't be erased by a court order. The house was mine, but the walls remembered everything. And then I realized that victory isn't about documents or seals. Victory is the ability to move on without letting the past hold you by the throat. I didn't know how long it would take me to fully understand this, but I understood one thing immediately. I would never again let anyone tell me I had to justify my existence. My parents, who were supposed to be my support, did everything they could to make my life a burden. But that's precisely how I became who I am. Their cruelty taught me to work twice as hard. Their humiliation made me stubborn. Their indifference taught me to find my place in the world. And even though it was the most painful way to learn, I survived and emerged stronger. Destiny isn't something you choose, and neither are your parents. Some are born into families where they are loved and protected, while others are given trials that seem unbearable. I fell into the latter category, but I no longer see it as a death sentence. Yes, I didn't have a normal childhood. Yes, I lived with people for whom I was nothing more than a source of money and problems. But it was precisely this that gave me the chance to become independent before others, taught me to fight, and most importantly, to appreciate those who are truly there for you, not for their own gain, but for your own sake. When Laura came to visit, we would sit and talk for a long time. She told me about her life, how she often imagined me growing up, and each time apologized for not being able to be there. I was no longer angry with her. I realized that holding on to the past meant allowing those people to control me again. I chose something else, to accept her into my life and give myself a chance to feel what a real family means, albeit late. I decided to remodel the house. I removed the old furniture, repainted the walls, replaced the floors. It was a symbolic step. I was cleaning out not only things, but also memories. Every new object, every fresh paint spoke of the fact that this was now my story, my life, and it had nothing in common with those who once called me a burden. After the trial, my parents disappeared from my life. I heard that they had moved to another state, that they were barely making ends meet, that no one in the family wanted anything to do with them anymore. I felt no joy at their downfall, but I also felt no pity. They had made their choice. And if fate had now shown them the other side of life, then that was how it was meant to be. I often think about what would have happened if I had different parents. Maybe I would have been happier, gentler, more trusting. But then I wouldn't be myself. I wouldn't have learned to fight. I wouldn't have become the owner of a house. I wouldn't have met Laura again. Fate is different for everyone, and sometimes it seems too cruel. But it is fate that makes us who we ultimately become. And today, sitting in my house, I no longer feel like a burden. I see before me a man who has lived through betrayal, hatred, and lies, but was able to persevere and build his own life. I know one thing: parents are different. Some give their children love, while others give them scars. But even scars can be turned into strength if you don't let them control you. I realize that I no longer live to prove anything to anyone. I live for myself. And this is perhaps the greatest victory of my life.